Before we begin, thank you very much to Lumpy Returns. Look, he added the exclamation point. It's not my fault. But thank you for contributing to my Patreon campaign over at patreon.com/TJOmega. We are getting dangerously close. Well, dangerous in my case. Dangerously close to actually having to do every single Beast Wars episode as an individual video. What have I gotten myself into? Let's see if we can let's see if we can actually clear that and like completely kill my free time. So, today I wanted to talk to you about Alternators. This was the very first attempt to create a collector's line for Transformer fans, and the very first attempt to bring back the original G1 characters in modern, updated toy form. That met with somewhat okay results. Alternators seem fondly remembered, but at the time, they were infamous for shelf warming, complexity that a lot of current fans then weren't really used to and couldn't really figure out. Some examples were pretty infamous for being very complicated, and ultimately the line just did not last very long. So, I wanted to go through what we did get out of the Alternator line and let you know that it's not just like the problems didn't just start at the retail level. The problems with Alternators is so much more widespread than some may realize. It is probably the most problematic Transformer series I've ever heard of, where almost every single release was tainted by some problem going on. So, I'm going to go through a list of all the Alternator releases, and we're just going to go over exactly what happened to them in production that made it so weird and made everything go bad. Now, to preface this, I'm going to go in order as much as I can for the mold releases, but we may skip around a little bit if it makes sense for the overall story. But let us begin. We're going to start where the Alternator line started, and that is with Smokescreen. Now, originally, they were going to make Blue Streak the first release in the series. Takara's marketing people decided, no, Smokescreen would be far more impactful visually as a first of a new toy line. And they were right. I think a lot of people got really excited when they saw how detailed the figure was. Now, it ended up becoming the second release, but by then, they couldn't get the name Blue Streak trademarked, so they had to go with the alternate name of Silver Streak, which actually has a history in and of itself. Beyond that, we got a third release as, of all characters, Ricochet. Okay, that's a Jazz repaint normally, but whatever. They had a Jazz mold by then, but they were going to re-release it soon, so they decided not to do Ricochet from Jazz. Why they decided to do it from the Silver Streak mold, who's to know? Anyone's guess. It also became Blue Streak in Japan, and I do mean Blue Streak, with that name in particular because it was actually blue, looking like Smokescreen without its sponsors all over. Speaking of, this mold in general was a bit of a nightmare for completionists because not only did the Japanese release have both a 7 and an 8 written on the side, depending on which version you got, but the Silver Streak version had both left side and right side steering wheel variations. So that was fun to figure out. We're going to talk about Trax next, because that one, above all, has some of the strangest circumstances. It was also the second Alternator ever designed, because the original concept was to take all of the original characters and give them modern versions of their original vehicles, which licensing proved to be a far more difficult job than they originally intended. That was true with Trax as well, because they designed him as a Corvette, but the license was refused because they thought, if they see our car breaking into little parts to transform, they'll think our vehicles are really flimsy. They must be really stupid, and the people who made that decision were even dumber, because guess what? That's not how it works. They did eventually change their minds, though. So, the work that they had been doing on another figure that was going to become Trax was put on hold, and the original design came back. So, beyond that, one of the things that Corvette wanted was a yellow vehicle. That was the official color of that particular model. So, in Japan, that's what Trax came out with. There was a yellow version and a blue version. However, in America, they used plastic for parts instead of die-cast. And when you turn some of those die-cast parts into plastic, they were too thin, and the yellow actually showed the parts through through the figure. So they couldn't use the yellow, and blue became the primary color in America after all. So it took a long time. It had some weird hoops to jump through, but we eventually got a proper update to G1 tracks. The remold, Battle Ravage, aside from just being kind of weird that they picked Ravage to be a humanoid, that one went fine. You know, it's a little bit Beast Wars Ravage, I guess. And then later on, we got Swerve, one of the most infamously difficult alternators to get your hands on, having only been released late in the second generation of alternators, and then very short run, as after that, the entire line was rebooted into a third box style. The head itself was designed after the original toy from G1 Swerve, but for whatever reason, the color scheme was completely done differently. So all the appearance of what Swerve would have been, kind of lost. We move on to the second alternator, Sideswipe. This was the mold that was originally meant to be Trax. After Corvette denied Hasbro, they started working on this one, and they were going to give it a Trax head until Corvette finally relented. The head designed for this mold eventually went to the Corvette, and they recasted what they had worked on into Sideswipe. So beyond that, Sideswipe came out fine, no real oddities. And then, of course, the secondary head for the mold was Sunstreaker, obviously. However, there weren't any Decepticons in the line, so for whatever reason, they decided that this very Sunstreaker head would make a great dead end. So the Decepticon version was created, dead end, looking nothing like G1 dead end, but nevertheless cool. So, yeah, that one came first. We didn't get Sunstreaker for a long time after that. Hound got through mostly unscathed for the most part until we start getting into his remolds. Originally, he was intended to be a Rubicon instead of a standard Wrangler, but they eventually went for the stock version, even though it meant the backpack had to be a little bit more kibbly than they originally designed him for. The retooling, however, was intended to be Trailbreaker. That was what the head was originally sculpted as, but due to trademark reasons, they couldn't get that name. And again, lacking Decepticons, they decided, let's make him Swindle instead. And at the very least, that head kind of looked more like Swindle than Sunstreaker's head looked like Dead End, I guess. They would repaint him again, but again, not as Trailbreaker, instead as Rollbar. And while Rollbar was a Jeep in G1, he was an olive green Jeep with a different head altogether. It basically became a completely new character that just happened to share the name, which, unfortunate circumstance. And my boy Trailbreaker just, he could never get a break in the 2000s. Next up, we're going to talk about Jazz, who again had a really complicated series of events during production. Originally, he was going to be a proper Porsche. In fact, he was the very first alternator toy designed. However, Porsche felt that Transformers was unworthy of the of the Porsche license, so they decided you don't get to have it. They also did not want their toys associated with their vehicles associated with war toys, which is the same reason why an alternator Bumblebee never happened, despite the blueprints for that one basically being done. So instead, he became a Mazda. And then he became Maester. The name Jazz, they couldn't get it. They didn't even put Autobot Jazz on the box. They used his Japanese name instead. So Maester with a different vehicle. So he became a very odd rendition of Jazz. The remold, again, weird because it was Shockwave as a car of all things. But this was the 2000s where we didn't have the Shockwave name. He was released as Shock Blast, just like the Energon toy. This mold was re-released in certain areas after the name was recovered in trademarks, but even then, it never got the Shockwave name. Oddly enough, there was an attempt to reboot Alternators, or rather Vinyltech, in Japan in 2008, probably based on the success of the licensed toys they did for the movie. And they did a brand new take on Jazz, which used the Shockwave version of the car, with, of course, two hands and Jazz's head, and a more silver paint job. But, of course, we don't really talk about those because it didn't go anywhere after that. One of the releases that was relatively fine was Grimlock. The oddest thing about him was seeing a Dinobot done with an actual vehicle mode. And then the fact that he was one of the most finicky of the alternators. Back then, he was infamous for how difficult he was to transform. And I'm sure the collectors who now play with modern masterpieces wish they could go back to how simple Alternator Grimlock was by comparison. When they went to redo the figure, it was originally conceived to be Windcharger. However, that plan got changed because of issues with the mold we're going to talk about next, so it became Wheeljack, which, you know, it's a weird one, but I kind of liked Alternator Wheeljack, to be honest. As for Windcharger, the toy that we got for him was originally supposed to be Overdrive, the Omnibot. Think of this. This was the very first time that we were getting G1 characters in modern form, and they were planning to do Overdrive of all characters. A character that, to this day, even with how many G1 toys have been cluttering the market for over a decade now, has never gotten a new figure. I don't think any of the Omnibots have. So, think of the weird universe we had back then when Overdrive had prominence. But, again, due to trademark reasons, they couldn't get the name Overdrive, so he became Windcharger. And then we got a little bit more problems when the long-barreled weapon that he was designed for wasn't going to pass US safety laws, which meant the barrel was completely removed, giving him what didn't even seem to be a gun anymore. I think most of us passed it off as some kind of scanner accessory, as flimsy as that is. What was really weird was everything that came after. Like, this is probably the weirdest mold out of everything in Alternators and Vinyl Tech. So, there was a remold done in yellow and black with a brand new head. The head that it got actually looked like G1 Windcharger. It was the head that was originally going to go on the remold of Grimlock. However, they already used Windcharger, so now the head in pre-production was just Decepticon Windcharger, and then by the time they actually got around to releasing the figure, they hadn't really figured out what he was going to be or who he was going to be. So he ended up being Decepticharge. That's an actual name that someone got paid to come up with. Decepticon Windcharger is named Decepticharge. It's one of the funniest little name things I've ever heard. And it should have just been drag strip, if we're just being honest. You're going to release a yellow car. Why not? When the mold was supposed to be released in Japan, they wanted to make it Wild Rider, but due to trademark reasons, couldn't make that happen. So instead, they concepted this as, of all characters, Black Arachnia. They're going to remold Windcharger, who was supposed to be Overdrive, into Black Arachnia. And then that didn't happen either. That one got canceled. The mold finally saw release in Japan as RC. I guess they were just really hard up on trying to get a female character into this line, and this was a scrawny alternator, so best chance they had. And then, later on, a Paradron Medic repaint of RC was planned, and subsequently canceled. Meaning this has multiple cancellations in it at many different levels, and definitely ranks as like one of the strangest examples in this toy line. Prowl's another curious case. They announced him at OTFCC 2004 by saying that they weren't working on an Alternator Prowl, but they were doing a different emergency vehicle, which met with a chorus of boos from the crowd. So, the one they were intending to do was Red Alert. The toy that they were designing looked a lot like Red Alert. You know, it had the chest going down. You know, it had the wheels, and like everything was in the proper location to actually look like like Red Alert. However, this crowd response was probably a little bit of why they changed gears and ended up going with Prowl instead. So we got a very weird looking Prowl as a result. And then that meant that any plan Takara had ended up going down the drain, so we ended up getting Red Alert redone from the Subaru mold. So instead of getting Blue Streak, Smokescreen, and Prowl all as the same mold like we were supposed to, what like the natural place of the universe, we got Smokescreen, Blue Streak, Red Alert. We swapped, we just completely swapped our emergency response vehicles. It's bizarre. So, beyond that, nothing really weird about its repaint. It was repainted into camshaft, so an Omnibot did actually get a modern toy. Again, looks really nothing like him other than the vehicle mode's gray. But they were originally designing him with Diaclone Blue Streak in mind. But, of course, Japan had already used Streak, and then Blue Streak, and we already used Silver Streak, so we were all out of streaks. So that one never really came to fruition either. Optimus Prime was kind of infamous for its difficulty in release. Takara didn't want to do it at all because a pickup truck is pretty much an unknown vehicle in Japan. They didn't think anyone would buy it, unless it was Optimus Prime himself. Hasbro wanted him to be a completely different character. We don't know which one they had in mind. Ironhide, Trailbreaker, don't know, but Takara wanted Optimus Prime, so they got Optimus Prime. Actually, no, they didn't. When they originally solicited the figure in Japan, it was supposed to be Jinrai. That was so ironically, they wanted it to be Prime, and then they decided, no, we're not going to do that. Eventually, the mold was released in the Kiss Players line as Convoy, and then released properly as Binaltech Convoy 2 years later. Beyond that, it is infamous for being the most expensive alternator to produce, is noticeably much larger than the others, and apparently cost twice as much to develop as the other ones. So not a real surprise when they tried to reuse it as much as they could, including the Nemesis repaint that was an exclusive here in America and notoriously hard to get. I remember having to wait months for my pre-order to come in, but and everywhere else in the world where it was released, it shelf-warmed. They also wanted to do Black Convoy in the Binaltech Asterisk line in Japan, but that ultimately got canceled. Now, through all of this weirdness, there are two molds that did get through pretty much fine. One of them was Mirage. So Mirage ended up perfectly okay. The mold is fine. Its remold is Rodimus, also fine. No real weirdness in trademark or anything like that. It pretty much got to do whatever it wanted. And similarly for Skids. They did produce it. They produced it in both countries. They didn't have any trouble with the names or the licenses. The weirdest thing about him was the fact that they had to add all those weird flame decals to the American version to make a Scion look cool. Tip, you can't make a Scion look cool no matter what you do. You just can't. It's not possible. It is a toy that shelf-warmed in America and apparently didn't do well in Japan either because it was the last release before they canceled Binaltech outright in Japan. Good going, Skids! It did continue a little bit longer here in America. In fact, we got Ravage and Rumble, two brand new molds, and both of them, the very first molds released as Decepticons first, intended to be Decepticons from the start. Rumble is very different from his original concept, where he would have used the front and the back halves, or back thirds of the vehicle, the hood section and the trunk section, as his arms, so the tires would just come straight out as his pile drivers. Very different and very simplified take is what made it to the shelves. And then, of course, Ravage as an actual Jaguar, because his Japanese name is Jaguar, he is intended to be a Jaguar. Probably one of the most brilliant alternator toys there is, simply for the concept alone. They never got released in Japan. In fact, I don't believe Rumble even got released in Europe, making it the most limited release of any Binaltech alternator or otherwise. And also, very rare example of a Rumble that never got repainted into Frenzy. And don't tell me he's already Frenzy, we're not getting into that argument. And I believe that covers just about every figure in the line and every single release. There's a little bit more weirdness that we can go through. So originally they weren't sure what size it was going to be, so they had they had like a deluxe size Smokescreen that was prototyped as well. We never got to see that. Of course, there was that tiny Auto Trooper that was released during Kiss Players, so we got like one alternator at super tiny size. If I remember right, they originally prototyped the idea of doing alternator jets and tanks that would have been huge. but that never made it past just like basic kit bash concept. We also had plans for a Cadillac convertible that was intended to be Megatron, but those plans fell through as well. There was a solicited reuse of the Mustang and Scion molds as different characters, but who those characters were, we never found out. Those were canceled before they were ever announced, as was a Mini Cooper alternator that was solicited and then just kind of vanished from retailer order sheets quickly after, which, as a Mini Cooper owner, disappoints me incredibly. But that is the convoluted history of alternators. Considering there really aren't that many toys in line in general, it's shocking how much trouble they went through to actually get that toy line out. I cannot remember any other Transformer line that had so many problems, to the point where almost every single release had one problem or another going about it. And it's amazing that we got as much as we did. Today, I think the line would probably do a lot better than it originally did. Now, it'd be $50 a figure for the size and the complexity and the licensing and all that, but if you market it the same way you market something like core class figures in Kingdom, smaller masterpiece toys with a different concept, I think you might actually get away with something like this today. And thanks to the Hollywood success of Transformers, I don't think, you'd have too many car companies saying it was unworthy. Which, by the way, is still the reason we don't have a masterpiece Jazz, because they're still about that. So, who knows? It's a weird world out there. At the very least, I'd like to see this homage someday. I'm stunned every time a Sunstreaker is released that isn't done in a dead end at some point. A collector can dream, can't he? Guys, I am facing the most powerful enemy any YouTuber can face, the algorithm, and I need your help to defeat him. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment. Every time you do, we attack that algorithm and we drive it back until it can no longer defeat this channel. Thank you very much.